All right, hello everybody. Thanks so much for joining me. Welcome back to my channel. Today's going to be marking the start of week 9 in CS50x 2025. This week is on Flask. This is a condensed version of the live stream watch along. If you guys would like to watch it along live with me, feel free to do so. Link down in the description, or just go ahead and subscribe to the channel.
All right, this is CS50, and this is our last week in this here studio as we focus finally on web programming using not only Python, but a framework within Python called Flask, and combining with web programming HTML, CSS, perhaps some JavaScript, and so many of the ideas that we've been exploring over the past several weeks. Indeed, today is really about combining all of those various building blocks so that ultimately you can build something of your own, not only for this week's problem set, but perhaps, if you so choose, for your final project as well. Now let's consider where we left off last time, which was introducing HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, whereby we introduced you to how the browsers of the world and the web servers of the world intercommunicate using HTTP and a whole bunch of other protocols underneath those like IP and TCP in particular. So last week, though, when we began to write HTML and CSS and even a little bit of JavaScript, recall that we served up the web pages that we wrote by using a very simple command in VS Code that we pre-installed for you, namely HTTP-server. This was a little program whose purpose in life was just to listen for HTTP requests coming from your browser, or really any browser, and respond to them by sending the contents of files from your code space to the browser, typically a .html file, but if you had an image like a ping or a GIF, it too could get sent. A JavaScript file, a CSS file, really any files stored in your code space could be served up by HTTP server statically. And indeed, that's the key word here, is that everything we did last week was, within the context of HTML and CSS, static. We wrote it, we saved it or auto-saved it, and then we loaded it in our browser. If we wanted to make a change, we would go edit the file, resave it, or let it auto-save, and we would reload in the browser. But only once we got to JavaScript did we have any kind of dynamism. When I demonstrated, for instance, very briefly, how we might implement something like autocomplete, searching for all of the words that start with CAT in that big dictionary from problem set 5. But today, we're going to focus on things more server side. In fact, even the little bit about JavaScript that we introduced last week was all client side. That JavaScript code was written once on the server, downloaded to the browser, and then executed in the browser. But as a result, that JavaScript code didn't have access to, for instance, any information that might be stored in a database, unless somehow we enable it to somehow communicate again and again with that server. So really what we're going to do today is dive into the world of web programming, where we're actually going to write code in Python using functions and loops and conditionals. And unlike last week, we are going to use code to generate our HTML for us so that we can stop doing everything by hand, especially for websites that might have dozens, hundreds, thousands of web pages. There's no human in manually generating each of those web pages. It's somehow dynamically generated through web programming. So let's begin where we began last time, focusing on the structure of how we might request web pages, because we're going to make a little tweak this week. In particular, last week we looked at a canonical URL like this: HTTPS, which is the protocol or scheme, www.example.com/. And recall that the slash typically indicated that we wanted the default web page for the website. Now, that wasn't really germane last week when we were playing with a whole folder of files, but if you were to request the default web page on a website, it's typically, by convention, literally a file called index.html, at least on a lot of platforms. Sometimes it might be called index.htm. Sometimes it might be called default.aspx. There's different conventions, but very often when you just request slash, you're technically referring to a very specific file that has been configured on the server to be the default page that's served up. But you can, of course, be specifying specific files or even folders. So we looked at URL formats like this. If you want file.html, you simply append that to the end of the slash. If you want the default web page inside of a folder, you might do /folder/, and the server would serve that file up for you. If you wanted to be more explicit, you could specify /folder/file.html so that you can actually grab a specific file from a specific folder, and suffice it to say you can nest these things again and again if you've got multiple folders and subfolders. But today, and really onward, we're going to start talking about everything after the TLD as really being the path that the browser is requesting. So /path is just meant to generically mean whatever files and or folders are being requested in URLs. And we're also going to introduce slightly different nomenclature this week too, that yes, technically that's a path. specifying a specific file in a specific folder or set of folders. But in the context of web programming, what's especially powerful, those files and folders don't actually need to exist. Using web programming, using Python, for instance, you can specify specific paths that don't actually exist in your code space, but that represent a resource, indeed, uniform resource locator for URL, a resource that you want to be able to access via your browser. So route generically means what path do you want to select on a web server. Now, what's this going to mean for us? Well, once we have configured a route in code, we can even specify that that route takes user input. And recall that from last time, we introduced you to how Google.com works. And we didn't implement the back end of Google. We let Google do that. But we did implement our own front end for Google that allowed you to fill out a very simple form, click enter, and the web browser would then send automatically a request to Google server that somehow had key equals value, particularly Q for query equals, for instance, cat. And all of that followed a question mark. So this same URL format here, whereby we have /route, which refers to some path, and then question mark key equals value, and maybe an ampersand and more key equals values, means that today we're going to have the ability to implement the back end of Google if we so aspire, or really the back end of a website. And back end just means the part that really the programmer implements and touches. Front end generally means the part that the human, the user, interacts with. All right, so with that said, let me propose that if we want to be able to read URLs of this format that have some key equals value and maybe some other key equals value, we actually do need to introduce a bit of code. So let's consider now how this request, this HTTP request, is getting to the server. Well, recall that when you request something like cat via a web page submitting to Google via a form, technically inside of that virtual envelope is a message like get/search question mark Q equals cat. Then some mention of the version of the protocol being used, like version 2 of HTTP, maybe a reminder of the host of the server that's specifically being requested, and then a bunch of other stuff that we saw last time as well. And ideally, we want the server to respond to that request. But here's where things get interesting. How in the world do you go about writing code that opens up that virtual envelope, reads that get line and the /search and the question mark and all of those keys and values? Well, we could write code very methodically, maybe using a for loop and iterating over every character, but that sounds like a lot of work. And in fact, it's been much better in CS50 alone that once you understand some concept, rather than reinvent that wheel yourself, use a framework, or rather, use a library instead. And indeed, that's what we're going to focus on today, is a very popular micro framework in the world of Python, which means a relatively small library that solves some very common problems and saves us the trouble of having to write all of the code that reads the insides of those virtual envelopes and figure out exactly what web page is requested or route and exactly what keys and values
in
were
Python,
passed
I
in.
like that. In
To
Python's
do so,
always good.
we're going to go ahead ultimately and not use HTTP-server anymore. That, recall, is a command that only serves up static content. Starting today, we're actually going to run a command, namely Flask run. So not only is Flask a library, as we'll soon see, which means we have functions and other features of it we can use in our own code, it's also, once you install it, a command that you can run in a terminal window like your own code space. And so ultimately, instead of running HTTP-server today, we're going to run Flask run to still start a web server, but a web server that's even smarter than HTTP server, because it's not just going to spit out the raw contents of files to the browser. It's actually going to execute your and my Python code to generate those web pages dynamically. So in order to get to that point, we're going to have to start creating some files of our own and really writing some programs of our own. And the convention when using Flask, this popular micro framework, which again is just a library that standardizes how you and I solve some common problems, we're going to need typically at least two files. One by convention called app.py, and a second one called requirements.txt, or txt. And each of these files in conjunction will be understood by that Flask command, because Flask knows to look for a file like app.py and knows how to execute it. And as we've done so many times in past languages, here, for instance, now in Python, while using the Flask framework, is how we might implement the simplest of web applications. So at a glance, this is going to look a little strange because there's a lot going on the screen, but clearly that first line indicates that we are importing from a library called Flask some kind of feature known as Flask capital F. So it's a little weird, but that's often a convention to import from something lowercase, something that's capitalized, to make clear that it's really what's called a class in the world of object-oriented programming, but more on that down the line. And then the second line of code says to Flask, please turn this file into a web application. So this is a little arcane, but underscore underscore name underscore underscore is something we saw so briefly a few weeks back in week 6 when I said at the time you sometimes need to check what the name of this file is, and does it equal quote unquote underscore underscore main underscore underscore, because that enables you to more correctly implement libraries of your own, which we did not do, but I just mentioned that you might see it in the wild. Well, here it is again in a different form. Underscore underscore name underscore underscore is essentially a special variable that refers to the name of this current file. So the second line of code is essentially telling Flask, please turn this file into a web application and let me refer to it via a variable called, quite simply, app. Now after that, there's some new weird syntax, but this is technically just Python, a feature we haven't yet seen. Technically, you're seeing now the @ sign for probably the first time, app, which is that same variable, dot route, and then an argument there too. So this is what's an example in Python of what's called a decorator. And a decorator is a feature of Python whereby you can wrap one function inside of another. For our purposes today, what this third line of code essentially means is, hey, Flask, please turn the following function into a route that can be served up by the server to a browser. What is that function? Well, the function that I want to associate with that route is literally a function called index, but I could call it anything I want. I could call it foo, bar, baz, or anything, but index makes sense if this is meant to be the index of my website. And the only thing that function does for now is literally return a string, or str in Python speak, namely quote unquote hello world. So that is it. And the fact that the argument to the app.route function, whereby route is a function or method inside of that app variable or object, the quote unquote slash just tells Flask whenever the user visits like example.com/, please call this function and send to the browser whatever this function returns. Now, long story short, this is not the only way to implement a web application, but this is the way to do it using Flask, this very popular micro framework. If you were to use something else, like in Python, there's a framework called Django, and there's many others in many other languages as well. This just standardizes for us what are the conventions when I want to create a route and I want to return some HTML, because you can solve that problem any number of ways. But what's important today is really the application of last week's ideas, even though we're using a very particular framework. And this is not meant to say that you're learning Flask and CS50 per se, but you're learning a web framework that's going to be representative of many others out there as well. But we chose one that's both popular and relatively simple. So with that said, I think let's go ahead and implement the very first of our web applications here, namely by switching over to VS Code here. And within my VS Code environment, I've sort of hidden some distractions. I've already closed my activity bar, and I've closed the File Explorer so that, as always, we have room for some code tabs, and we have my terminal at the bottom. But like last week, I also have an additional tab inside of my terminal area here for not only the terminal window itself, but also these here ports. Recall that last time we talked about TCP ports in particular, unique integers that identify certain services like 80 for web servers or 443 for the secure version, HTTPS thereof. Here again, we see port 1337, which is meant to connote LEET, because this is a CS50 specific use of this TCP port. But soon we'll see another port just like we did last week when I launched HTTP server. So let's go ahead first and create a file, for instance, called app.py. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to isolate all of these files to a specific folder. So I'm going to create a new folder with make dir, and I'm going to call it hello for my first application called hello. I'm going to cd into hello, and indeed now I'm in there. And now I'm going to run code of app.py to begin writing the contents of this here web application. And for this, I'm pretty much just going to use the contents of the sample program we saw a moment ago by doing the following. I'm going to say from Flask, import Flask, lowercase f and uppercase f respectively. Then I'm going to say app equals capital Flask underscore underscore name underscore underscore, which is the line of code that says, hey, Flask, turn this file into a web application and give me a variable called app via which to reference it. And then down here, I'm going to do @app.route, and then in parentheses pass in a single argument slash. I could use single quotes. I could use double quotes. For consistency with C, as we did in week 6, I'm going to keep using double quotes most of the time. Now I'm going to go ahead and define a function in Python called index, but I could call it anything I want. This particular function is not going to take any arguments, so all it's going to do is return a string or str of text, hello, comma, world. And that's it. Now, just to be consistent with style 50, I've actually deliberately left a couple of lines blank in between my function and everything above it, and that's just a stylistic convention in Python. But otherwise, this is just some relatively little Python code, albeit using a couple of new features, a new library, and using a new piece of syntax, the @ sign, for that so-called decorator. And again, to be clear, all a decorator does in Python, or in this particular case, is it says, hey, Python, turn the following function into one that should be called automatically whenever the user requests the /route. All right, I need to do one more thing, at least on some systems. Let me go ahead and run code of requirements.txt. And in this file, I'm going to simply specify what are all of the libraries that I want this web application to use. And I'm quite simply going to say Flask, capital F here. But strictly speaking, it's not necessary because in CS50.dev, because we've pre-installed Flask for you. But in general, and certainly in the real world, what I'm doing now is associating with this application 0 or more list of dependencies, libraries that I want someone to install in order to ensure that this thing here works. That's all I need to put in this file. But even though it's already been installed, what I can do is this. Let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window here. And let me run that command we ran briefly back in week 6 when we wanted to install libraries. I'm going to do pip install. And instead of installing cow say or something silly like that again, I'm going to do pip install -r requirements.txt. And what this command would do for me, if Flask is not already installed, is it would install it for me on this here system. So I'm not going to bother executing that because I already did it earlier for everyone's code space. But that's indeed how we could use that requirements file to automatically install things without having to manually typing that and other things out. All right. Well, let's go ahead now and do something incorrectly.
What was in the requirements TXT?
What I'm doing now is
Flask. Just Flask.
Associate want someone, but code space. But that's indeed how we could use things out. All right. Well, let's go ahead now and do something incorrectly. Suppose I'm in the habit of forgetting things, and I run http-server in my terminal window. I can certainly run it, and it's certainly going to work, especially if I override this helpful reminder we put in place to discourage you from doing this. But I'm going to say, nope, I want to go ahead and run it. I'm going to see the same kind of output as I saw last week. I'm going to be prompted to open in a browser that particular web application. But that particular web application is not really my own per se. It's just the contents of this folder. So if I go ahead and zoom in on the directory index of that there folder, we see my two files, app.py and requirements.txt. If I click on app.py, I'm not going to get a hello world. In fact, it was a little subtle. But what my Mac just did was it downloaded app.py, which is not the goal I want. And in fact, you've just let the world access your source code if there's anything sensitive in that there program, because the browser doesn't know what to do with an app.py file inside of my browser. So that was incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead and go back here. But just to make clear that we do indeed have a second port running now, just like last week, because HTTP server can't use port 80 or 443 because code spaces, that is CS50.dev, is already using that for you. It did choose the default port of 8080, which is commonly used for development purposes. And that's why we see not only 1337, but 8080 now as well.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and back to my terminal window, hit Control-C to interrupt HTTP server, and let me now do things the right way by running Flask run enter. And what we'll see now is that my application is running not on 8080, but on 5000, which happens to be Flask's default choice of ports. But you can override this if you so choose. But I'm going to stick with that one. And now, even though it's a little underwhelming, I'll zoom in. Now I see hello, comma, world.
Nice.
And in fact, if I right-click or control-click on Chrome here, or your browser more generally, and for instance, view page source, you will see that there's really no even HTML here, just text, because what I've essentially sent to the browser is just literally hello, comma, world. But already, we have a building block here. Clearly, I can write Python code that generates output that is sent to the browser. So really, there's nothing stopping me from now sending not just raw text, but actual HTML to the browser. Let's do this sort of poorly at first. Let me go ahead and hide my terminal window just so we can focus on code now for a moment, even with Flask actually running. And this is going to look deliberately ugly for the moment, but let me go ahead and do this. If I want to send the browser a proper web page, heck, I remember some HTML from last week. So open bracket, exclamation point, doc type HTML, close bracket, and then open bracket HTML, then lang equals quote unquote en for English. Then I'm going to go ahead and do head for the head of the page, and then title for the title therein. And I'm just going to say something like hello, comma, title, like I did last time. Let me close that title tag. Let me close that head tag. Let me open now my body tag. Inside the body, I'll say hello, comma, body. I'll close the body tag. I'll close the HTML tag, and I'll close my quotes. But I'm going to be careful here. Notice that I used an attribute value in here with double quotes. That's probably going to confuse Python because I have these outermost double quotes. So I can fix this in a couple of ways. I'm going to go ahead and use, therefore, single quotes on the outside of this Python string, which, unlike C, is fine for strings, not just chars as in C. And I think that will at least assure that the quote marks don't get confused. All right. This is probably not going to be the best design, and hopefully this is not how we generate web pages, but let me go ahead back to my other browser tab, which previously said hello world. Let me reload now, and I seem to have changed not only the output of this web program, but really the contents underneath the hood as well. Let me right-click or control-click on the white portion of my screen here, and there is some proper HTML. It's not particularly pretty printed. There's no new lines. There's no indentation. But if I scroll from left to right in my browser here, there is a well-formed web page as I intended. So again, not particularly fun, not particularly pretty, but we seem now to have the capability of writing code that generates not only text, but HTML as well. So how can we go about improving this program further? Well, let me do this. This is not really the nicest design. So let me go ahead and highlight all of this HTML I just wrote. And let me go ahead and cut it to my clipboard. And let's come back to that code file in a moment. Let me go ahead and reopen my terminal. I don't want to kill Flask run just because it's convenient to keep it running. So I'm going to create a second terminal window by clicking plus. And I can toggle between them at right here. So one is still running Flask. The other is now a blinking prompt. I'm in the wrong directory by default, so I do need to go back into my hello folder with cd hello. But in here, what I'm going to do now is this. I'm going to go ahead and create another folder inside of this that by convention is called templates. And when I hit enter here, I'm going to then do cd templates to go inside of it. And now I'm going to create an actual full-fledged HTML file, index.html by convention. Enter. And inside of this file, I'm going to go ahead and paste that long string of HTML. And I'm going to go ahead and clean it up to look a little bit more like it looked last week. And I'm going to even stylize it further here so everything's very pretty printed and human readable. And I'm going to put the head up there. I'm going to put the body down here. And below that, I will close my HTML tag. So no different in terms of the content. But now I have all my HTML in an actual file. All right, what do I now do with this? Well, wouldn't it be nice if I could go back into app.py and say, don't return just hello world, don't return this long, messy string of HTML, but return the contents of a file called index.html. Well, to do that, I can import not just Flask capital F from the Flask library. I can also import a function called render template. This is a function specific to Flask, but it does exactly that. It will render a template for you in the sense of it will go open an HTML file for you. It will then send it from server to browser. And as we'll soon see, it can even do some fancier stuff than that. But now, instead of returning quote unquote hello world or quote unquote a big long string of HTML, what I'm actually going to do is something like this. I'm going to say like HTML equals render template. And what template do I want to render? Index.html. And I'm going to store that template, so to speak, in an HTML variable. And then I'm going to return that variable. Of course, as we've seen in C and Python and even JavaScript, we don't really need variables per se if we're just defining them and using them once. So I can actually tighten this up a bit. Let me go ahead and highlight the actual function call, get rid of the variable, and let me just immediately return the return value of render template. passing in index.html. Now notice the subtlety. If I go back to my terminal window, recall that I created index.html inside of my templates folder, which is inside of my hello folder. But render template is smart. As its name implies, its purpose in life is to render a so-called template. More on what we really mean on that in a moment. But by default, Flask knows that if you're trying to render a template, oh sure, it must be in your templates folder. It's got to be all lowercase, templates. Your file has to be exactly named as I'm specifying here. But this is now how a web server can associate a route like slash with a specific file on the actual server, no matter what folder it might be in. So let me go back to my other tab. Let me go ahead and cross my fingers as always and click reload. And so far, so good. And in fact, just to prove to you that this is the new version of my HTML that was pre-printed, let me go to View Page Source. And there indeed it is, printed in the browser's memory, just as I wrote it on the server.
So what's the point of this, really?
All right. So now let's take a look at the code as we left it, whereby for the slash route, we are returning the return value of the render template function once passed an argument of index.html. And let's see if we can't make our web application truly more dynamic, so that it's not just saying hello title, hello body all of the time, but ideally saying hello to a particular person. Now, how can I possibly pass user input to a web application? Because my users on the internet certainly don't have access to my keyboard, let alone my terminal window. They only have access to my website via a browser. But of course, as we saw in the Google example, if you were to pass in somehow at the end of the URL, not just a route, but also a question mark and key equals value, maybe an ampersand, key equals value, maybe another ampersand, key equals value, we can somehow send from the browser to the server user input. Of course, that user input ideally does not come from the human typing it in manually to the URL, but filling out a form, hitting enter, and letting the browser convert that form to the appropriate GET request in the URL. But let's start to simulate this for now. Let me go back to this URL here, put my cursor at the end of it, and say question mark, name equals, for instance, David. The intent being that I want this site to say hello David instead of hello title and hello body. Enter. Unfortunately, when I hit enter, nothing changes. And I can confirm as much by viewing source. And indeed, nothing about the page has changed because we haven't done anything dynamic in code. But I do think we can fix this. Let me go back over to VS Code here, and let me propose that we go into the template first, which currently only says hello title, hello body. Let's go ahead and simplify the title for now and focus on just dynamically changing the body. And let me propose that what I really want this thing to say is hello, and then a placeholder. So I don't want to literally say placeholder, where placeholder is just something into which we plug in a value, because now I'm going to see a website that says hello, comma, placeholder. So the syntax you're about to see is a little bit different, but it's going to be a technique via which I can tell Python, specifically Flask, to substitute a value for this here placeholder. And the syntax for that, when using Flask, is to do 2 curly braces on the left and 2 curly braces on the right. It's a little different from our F strings or format strings in Python alone, but in the context of an HTML template, the way you specify, hey Flask, substitute a value here, is indeed with 2 curly braces on the left and the right. Now, of course, nothing's going to happen yet until I go back to app.py and actually tell the template somehow to plug in a value therein. Now, how can I go about doing this? Well, the simplest way, which is as follows. In addition to importing Flask and render template, I'm also going to import another variable that comes with the Flask framework called request. And this is a special object that's going to give me access to all of the HTTP parameters, the user input in the HTTP request that's causing this code to be executed. So how do I use that? Well, let me go down here and let me create a variable called anything, but I'll call it name. And I'm going to go ahead and set that equal to something like request.args, open bracket, quote unquote, name, close quote. Now, what in the world is going on here? Well, it turns out what we've introduced here now is a special variable, request.args, that somehow magically, automatically stores all of those key value pairs. And here again is why we're using a framework like Flask, because it's not going to be particularly fun code to have to write code that opens that virtual envelope, reads the HTTP message inside of it, parses, or that is analyzes and figures out what is each key, what is each value, what route is requested. Like every website on the internet practically is probably doing exactly that nowadays. We might as well not reinvent that wheel ourselves. So in request.args, we have this special variable that comes with Flask that just gives us a Python dictionary that contains all of those key value pairs. And in fact, think back to week 5 when I proposed that dictionaries, or dics in Python, are so very useful because they allow you to associate keys with values, keys with values. That's what Flask is doing here. So if I go back to my code, what we really see is that I'm creating a variable called name, and I'm setting it equal to the value of the name key inside of this dictionary. That is, request.args is a Python dictionary at this point. How now do I pass in the value of that variable to my template so that we actually see hello, comma David, or hello, comma someone else? Well, in app.py, I have to pass now a second argument to render template, and the convention for that is placeholder equals name. In other words, I can use Python's feature for named parameters, which we've seen before, like the print function in Python has that end parameter that we can use to override the line ending, which is by default /n. Here, I'm passing in a positional parameter in Python, which just means the first one, first position. But then I'm passing in a second parameter that has an explicit name, and the name I'm giving it is literally placeholder. Why? Because I want Flask to replace placeholder in this template with the actual value of the name variable. So if I go back to my second tab here, which previously said hello title, hello body, but notice a moment ago we passed in question mark name equals David, which was previously ignored. Now if I reload this page, having changed my Python code in app.py, there is my hello David, and my tab is more simply now just hello. All right, unfortunately, this is not the best solution. Why? Because suppose that a user doesn't visit this URL and certainly doesn't have the wherewithal to type in manually question mark name equals David. Let me go ahead and delete that HTTP parameter, the key value pair. Let me go ahead and reload this page now. And now I got a bad request, a 400 error, which means I did not request this website correctly. Now that's just kind of bad design, right?
Okay.
Because surely the user should be able to visit a URL without having to manually type in parameters. So how do we fix this? Let me go back to my other tab for VS Code. Let me go ahead and open up app.py, and it seems to be the case that I'm just blindly assuming on lines 8 and 9 at the moment that there will be a key called name inside of this dictionary. And clearly that's not the case if the user has not visited a URL that has question mark name equals something. So I think we just want to use some week 1 style logic using Python syntax specifically to say something like this. Let me go ahead and change line 8 to ask a question first. If there is a name key inside of request.args, then and only then go ahead and create a variable called name whose value is request.args quote unquote name. Else, if there is no name key in that dictionary, we've got to handle that situation, which I wasn't a moment ago. All right, fine. Let's create a name variable and set it equal to some default value like world. And now line 12 can remain unchanged because no matter what, I'm passing in a legitimate value for name that's either whatever the human typed in the URL bar, for instance, or it is by default world. So if I go back now to my other tab, and without changing the URL, I just click reload, now we're back to something correct, if underwhelming, that says hello, comma, world. Of course, this is a little maybe suboptimally designed in that, well, I've used my placeholder already. What if I want to say 2 placeholders or 3 placeholders or more? I probably shouldn't be in the habit of literally using the word placeholder in my template, even though that's what it is. Let me go ahead and be a little more descriptive, just like with our variable names in general. And let me go ahead and say what I really want here is hello, comma, name, where I want the value of name to be interpolated, just like in an F string, inside of these double curly braces. But I now need to change my code. Because I've now changed my placeholder to literally be name, this is going to look a little weird, but the convention in using this library is quite often to say now name equals name. Why? because the name of the parameter I'm passing in to the left of the equal sign must match the name of the parameter that I'm using in my template. Though the value that I want to pass in for that placeholder can be anything I want. It can literally be quote unquote David, but if the value is in a variable, then what I want to do is pass in the name of that variable. So this looks a little stupid, admittedly, but this is the convention, for better or for worse. Name equals name means plug in the value of the name on the right for the template placeholder called name on the left. That's all. But this is indeed a common convention. Now, is there a better way to do this? Well, this feels a little bulky to have 4 lines of code, if this, else that, just to check if an HTTP parameter was passed in. And in fact, there is. The convention in Flask would actually be to not bother with this explicit if else, but instead to do something like this. Name equals request.args, and then specifically call a method or a function called get, whose purpose in life is to get the value of a key. What key? Well, the name key. And what the get function also does for us is if it can't find a value there, you can specify a default value. So if you want the default value to be world, you pass that in as a second argument. So the behavior now is going to be no different. But if I go back to my other tab and click reload, nothing changes, but it's still working. It's not showing some error. However, if I go into my URL bar at top and add / name equals David, zoom out, and hit enter, it's still working in that case as well. But I've distilled those 4 lines of logic now into something a little simpler by actually having now a use of the get method, which is doing more of that logic for me. All right, so suffice it to say, this too is not the best design, because you certainly don't want to make a web application where your users, to provide user input, have to like manually edit the URL.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Like searching
it's like, well, what's the point of this?
Only being able to edit the URL by
how are they
adding
editing
/search
the
q
stuff
equals
or
cats
inputting
anytime
it?
you want to search for cats, let alone some other value. And certainly if you want to type in your email address or a credit card number or anything that we're in the habit of typing into forms on the web, you don't want to have to manually do that instead in the URL. Which is to say, how can we make this now a more typical web application that still takes user input, but takes it via a proper web form? We saw how to make forms last week. For instance, we made a front end for Google. Let's now implement the back ends thereof.
Back end,
so let me go back over to VS Code here now, and let me propose that we will create an actual form in index.html. So index.html's purpose in life is no longer to be a template that says hello, comma, so-and-so. All it's going to display is a template. So let me go ahead and delete this line here, and let me delete this use of a placeholder, and let me go into index.html and remove the body here that we had for that placeholder. And let's actually now, in this here body, create a web form. So I'm going to do form, and then inside of the form tag, I'm going to create an input. And the name of that input is going to be name, because I want the human's name. And the type of that text, the type of that input is going to be text, even though that's the implied default. But recall from last time, there's some nice features I can enable. Anytime I make a form, I can turn off autocomplete, so it doesn't remember the previous person's name. I can auto-focus that input so that the cursor is blinking and ready to go. And so that the human knows what to do with it, I can say placeholder equals quote unquote name, so that there's little gray text that's explanatory text. Now notice there's some potential confusion here. My use of name here is to define the name of the HTTP parameter that I do want to end up in the URL. The name here is the name of the HTML attribute that it comes with the input tag if you want to use it. Placeholder here is another attribute that can be used with the input element. So even though we're seeing lots of names and lots of placeholders, they're the same idea, but they mean different things in different contexts. Now we're looking at HTML alone. All right, besides that input field, let me go ahead and create a button. The type of this button is going to be submit, so it knows to submit this form. And I'm going to have that button say greet, so it's obvious that I click on this button to greet that person's name. All right, what more do I need in here? Well, this is just a form, which is fine visually, but I haven't told the browser where to submit it just yet. And if I don't specify that, it's actually going to submit back to the same URL, for instance, /, if that's what's serving this up. So if I actually want to change the action that the browser should really take, there turns out there is indeed an action attribute, which allows me to specify where I'm submitting this. And I'm not going to submit it to Google, for instance, this week. I'm instead going to submit it to my very own route, which doesn't yet exist, but it will in a moment, /greet. And the method I want to use is going to be specifically get where in contrast with post, because I do want to use get so that the parameters very visibly appear in the URL, if only so that I can show you what's happening. If I were to use post instead, recall, that sort of hides the input, still in the envelope, but sort of more deeply inside of it, so it's not exposed in the URL, which is appropriate for anything personal, maybe an email address, maybe a credit card number, a password, or the like. But this is just a person's name, so I'm OK for now with revealing it in the URL. All right, let's now go back to my other tab. If I delete the URL parameters there and hit enter and go back to my default template, I see indeed a form asking for a name and a button to greet someone. So I'm going to type in my name, David, and I'm going to click greet. And notice what happens to the URL at top. It does automatically bring me to /greet question mark name equals David. So I, the human, did not need to type all of that in as I have been. The browser knows when submitting a form via get, do that. Unfortunately, I get a 404 not found. Why? Because my app.py file only has one route for /. There is no route yet for /greet. So I think we can fix that too by just practicing.
Okay, I'm starting to understand now. I was having a little bit of, fuzziness with like, okay, what is the purpose of this? Like, why are we kind of getting into this if it's just showing us to use like if-else statements and get so and having to edit in the browser? But let's say you have a form, right? You can provide it an action, which will basically, update the URL at that point on that submission, right? So right here you can see that /greet has been included now. And then for the name of this input, and by coincidence it happens to also equal quote unquote name because it is receiving a person's name as input just by nature. So the name of this input form, right, is equal to name. So that is going to be the key associated with this input. Now, the value is whatever the person types in. So in this case, I typed in Richard. So that was saved upon the submission of the button, right, from this form. So when I submit this form using the button type submit, right, on the form, it performs the action to basically concatenate the /greet, web page, like, whatever, into the browser URL, and then saves that name inside of that URL. Now we can probably, in our app.py, retrieve that value, as you can see here, and now spew out some sort of alert or message to them, as you can see here with this render template. Return render template index.html name equals name. Okay, let's keep going here. I appreciate you guys for joining me here. We are watching Harvard CS50x week 9 on Flask. We're going to watch about half of this lecture tonight, and then we'll watch about the other back half tomorrow. I appreciate you guys for joining me. I am a little bit tired for some reason right now. I need some caffeine or something to wake up, but I don't have any in the house. So we are just powering through this one. But I'm not also too sure now, like, I'm sure we're going to get more and more into it. This is only the first 41 minutes of the lecture, but I'm not sure actually now, like, we have some practical application, but it seems kind of like, it seems kind of like a lot to have to, get these events, right, or this user data. It seems like kind of a lot of work. I wonder if there's a way that he's going to show us it's easier or condensed down or whatnot, but it just seems like a lot to remember. Like, you're already importing 3 separate things within this and having some like app.route things going on. It's kind of a lot to remember just for getting some simple name that was typed in, right? So let's just keep going here though.
What I've been preaching here as follows. Let's go into app.py and say app.route, quote unquote, /greet. And here too, I could call it anything I want, but I want parity with what I just put in my form. And inside of this, under this decorator, so to speak, I now need to specify exactly what function I want to be called when this route is visited. I can call this function anything I want, but to keep myself sane, I'm going to use a name for the function that kind of matches the route itself. So I'm going to call this function greet, even though it can be anything I want. And then after this function, which is not going to take any arguments, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to say in here, name equals request.args.get, quote unquote, name, to get the value of the name parameter from the get string. But if there's no such value there, let's grab a default value of world. And then, as before, I'm going to return the return value of render template. But this time, I'm going to render a different template that, to be fair, does not yet exist, but I can solve that problem too, greet.html. And I'm going to pass into that template, once it exists, the value of name equaling the value of that variable. So same ideas as before, but I've now moved a lot of my logic into a brand new function and route called greet.
OK.
All right, so what's now going to happen here? Well, let me go back to my browser, which previously was 404 not found because the route didn't even exist. I'm going to click reload, and I'm going to see a new problem, I think, because the route exists, but I don't think that template exists, greet.html yet. So let me hit enter, reload, and now I've got an internal server error, which, welcome to web programming. This is going to be the new segmentation fault of C, but in the context of web programming. When you see 500 internal server error, as much as you might like to hope otherwise, it is your fault. You have made a mistake somewhere, as I just did. So let's see how to diagnose this. Let me go back to my other tab. Let me reopen my terminal window. And thankfully, within my terminal window, I should see, among any number of other errors, some hint as to what went wrong. So to be clear, when you see a 500 error in your browser, internal server error, 1, it's your fault. But 2, there's probably diagnostically useful hints in your terminal window. If you've created 2 terminal windows, that's fine. You have to realize that your commands are going to be left alone. You have to go back to your other terminal window where Flask run is still running. And you might want to scroll up and down, look at the most recent error in there, and hopefully you'll see something useful. And indeed, I do think I do. Template not found, greet.html. And that's pretty much hitting the nail on the head and telling me exactly what there is wrong. But interestingly, we haven't seen this word yet, Jinja exceptions. Exceptions we've seen before, and you might recall that we can try to do something, but if an error happens, an exception might indeed be raised. Jinja, though, is a new term, and this is just referring to another library that anyone on the internet can use, but the folks who invented Flask decided to adopt this other library themselves called Jinja. And what Jinja is essentially a templating library. Its purpose in life is just to handle everything inside of that templates directory. So if I go back to my own index.html, it is technically a library called Jinja that is reading that template top to bottom, left to right, looking for, among other things, pairs of curly braces so that Jinja can do the substitution for you. Now, why is Flask using Jinja? Well, Flask realized, the folks who invented it, we don't have to reinvent the wheel of templating because some other people on the internet already created a templating library called Jinja, so we might as well use those in conjunction. And this is going to be more and more common. Even though when we started using libraries in C, they were very small and well-defined and only did one thing, once you get to web programming and really software engineering in the real world, you're going to be using multiple libraries, often in conjunction with each other, some of which are dependencies for other libraries. So we're just seeing an example of that. So this is to say, ultimately, this problem is still mine. Internal server error means I messed up. We know now from my terminal window that the template is not found. So what's the solution? Well, let's go ahead and create that template. Well, let me go back into my terminal window, but not the one with the error, but my other terminal window that gives me access to a working command prompt. Let me go ahead and type code greet.html and hit enter. And just to make the point, let me kind of pedantically type out this whole file again. So open bracket, exclamation point, doc type HTML. Then below that, HTML lang equals en. Then below that, let's put the head of this page. Inside of that, let's put the title of this page. We'll call it greet, just so I know which template is which. Then let's put the body of the page here. And then let's go ahead and do hello, comma, name, using the same placeholder as before. So in essence, my greet.html template is now what my index.html template used to be before I deleted the latter and replaced it with that interactive web form. But now, if I go back to app.py, we'll see that greet.html, which is to be rendered, should now work as intended. And I'm passing in name equals name so that I can have that template use of this placeholder substituted with the actual person's name. All right, let's cross our fingers, go back to my other tab, and reload this page. And there we have it. hello, comma, David. Let's now go back to the code via which this current application is implemented and consider what could be done better. In fact, let me reopen my terminal window and clear it temporarily and type in ls in my templates folder, just to confirm that I do indeed have two files. Let me do cd ... ls in my hello folder, just so that you can see what files are therein. And in fact, what you see here now is a pretty representative structure for a web application implemented in Python using the Flask framework. Before long, we'll see one more folder in here, not just templates, but something called static, because up until now, we haven't served up any images, any JavaScript files, any CSS files. We can, and by convention, those such files will be stored in another folder called static. So indeed, what you're seeing here is the representative list of files and or folders that you typically need to create at some point when building a Flask application. But I dare say, even though we're following these conventions, we haven't necessarily done things the best way. Why? Well, case in point, let me hide my terminal window and open up, again, index.html. Let me go ahead and open up greet.html. And if I toggle back and forth between these, you can clearly see that they're not changing all of that much. There's a lot of commonality. The doc type at the top, the HTML tag, the head tag, the title tag, the body tag. It's really only the contents inside of the latter, head, title, and body, that are actually changing. Moreover, let me point this out. Let me go back to my user interface here. Let me go back to my web form here. And you'll see that I've zoomed in a few times, so everything's very visible. But let me go ahead and open up this feature. Let me go to right-click or control-click on my viewport. Let me click Inspect to open the developer tools that we talked about last time. And notice that I can actually click this button here at top left, which is a useful toggle for changing the type of device you're visiting a website on. So for instance, if I type this now, what you'll see, if I shrink my developer tools, you'll see a mobile version of this web page. So what that button does in Chrome, at least, and other browsers have similar features, you see what this web page would look like on a mobile device. And suffice it to say, like, I can barely tell what's on the page. Like, the default font is clearly way too small. And at least on my phone, there really is no easy way to like zoom, zoom, zoom. You can tinker with the settings, but you don't want your users having to like zoom in just to use your website. Which is to say that my website as implemented now is not responsive to the type of device that's visiting it. It is not mobile friendly. Now, there's many different ways to address this, including using libraries, but minimally, a solution to this problem typically is to go in and add an additional tag to the head of your web pages. So let me go back to index.html. Let me go into the head here, and this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to use a tag called meta, which refers to metadata. I'm going to give it an attribute called name and set that equal to viewport. Why? I'm just following the documentation. Then I'm going to specify that the content of this meta, the content for this meta tag is going to be cryptically initial-scale equals 1, comma, width equals device width. This is a mouthful, and technically I'm reading it off of a sheet of paper because I can never remember exactly what to type here. But this tag alone will make my application and my website more generally more mobile friendly. It's not going to fix all of my potential problems, but it is going to tell the browser in particular that it should size things to the specific device width, be it an iPhone, an Android device, an iPad, a tablet of some sort, or the like. And case in point, if I now go back to my other tab, which is still in my mobile view mode, let me click reload now. And notice, even though there's the tiniest of forms up there in the top corner, when I reload now it's at least more usable. Still relatively small, but it's at least readable at this point. So that one meta tag alone goes a long way to making your website responsive in the sense that things are going to be resized automatically by the browser based on the device's type. I mention that only because it's going to lead to another design opportunity. Let me close my developer tools. Let me go back to VS Code here. And you know what? My greet template still doesn't have that mobile-friendly tag. So all right, fine. Let me just save myself some keystrokes. Let me highlight this whole line 6. Let me go into greet, into its head, paste that there, and OK. Now I'd argue that I've solved this problem on this page too. But where are we going with this? Well, most any time in CS50 when I've copied and pasted something, it's almost always been the wrong solution to a problem. It suggests a poor design because why copy paste if I can somehow factor out commonalities? And indeed, this is the point now to be made. If we toggle back and forth between these two files, index.html and greet.html, there is so much commonality. I dare say now, all of this is common from line 1 through part of line 7. All of this is common from line 15 down through line 17. Wouldn't it be nice if in HTML we can somehow factor out that code too? And here is where templates start to get very powerful, because the answer is indeed yes. We can actually factor out all of those common lines of HTML in such a way that we don't need to type them again and again. So now, let me propose that we'll create one more
this is
file,
what I was trying to figure out
even though
yesterday, too.
this will allow us to make these two files simpler as follows. I'm going to go into my terminal window where I have a command prompt. I'm going to cd back into my templates folder, and I'm going to create a new file called layout.html, which is a file name you need to adhere to when using Flask, because that's the default name.
Okay.
All lowercase, one word, layout.html. Enter. I've now got a new tab. I'll close my terminal window. And for the last time, hopefully, I'm going to type out doctype HTML. Then I'm going to do HTML lang equals quote unquote en. Then inside of that, I'm going to have the head of my page, inside of which I'm going to have the title of my page. And because this application doesn't really need to change that much, I'm just going to say the title for every page in this application is hello. But we could parameterize that if I wanted. I'm also, though, going to add that meta tag. So meta name equals quote unquote viewport. Content equals quote unquote initial scale equals 1, comma, width equals device width, close quote, close bracket. And then I'm going to have the body of my page. But here is where the website really varied by template. In index.html it was a form, but in greet.html it was hello so-and-so. So what I really want is a whole block of content potentially to go in here. So in fact, what I'm going to do inside of the body is use some weird-looking syntax. This is more Jinja syntax. And I'm going to say this: open curly brace, %, block body, close %, close curly brace. And then with nothing in between there, I'm again going to go open curly brace, %, and this time I'm going to say end block, one word, no space, %, close curly brace. So this is weird syntax. You'll have to look it up to remember it over time. But this is the way to specify to Flask, plug in the contents of another template here. Not just a variables value, but another file should go here. You can call this anything you want. I could call this foo or bar or baz, which are the go-to terms in computer science. But I'm going to call it body only because, one, I only have one such placeholder for now. And it's in my body. So let's just say this is the placeholder for the body of this web page. Keep it simple. So now, what can I do in my other files? Now that I have that template here, I can go back to, for instance, my index.html, and I can delete all of this. And I can delete all of this. So now in index.html is literally only the form that is going to vary for this particular page. Though I now need to tell Flask how to embed this snippet into my full layout. And the way to do that is as follows. At the top of your template, open curly brace, %, extends as a verb, quote unquote, layout.html. And this is a line of saying, this is the way of saying in Flask, please extend layout.html with the contents of this file. I do need to do one more thing. I need to define the block of code that I want Flask to substitute for me. And so here, too, I'm going to say block body, just like I did a moment ago. And then in here, below this, I'm going to say end block. And it's weird. This is a Jinja thing. It's block space body up here, but it's just end block down here. The word END is prepended to the name of this Jinja tag. Just to be a little nitpicky, I'm going to go ahead and indent this properly, so it's only indented once there, and that's it. And admittedly, this looks a little weird, but what's important is that now I've only implemented in this file the minimum amount of HTML that differs for this particular route. What am I going to do in greet.html? Well, I'm going to delete all of this up here, and I'm going to delete all of this down here. At the top of this file, I'm again going to say extends, quote unquote, layout.html, close quote, and then another %, and close curly brace. Below that, I'm going to say block body, %, close curly. And then down here, I'm going to say, as before, end block, and close that tag. I'm going to fix the indentation here just to be consistent. And now I have a second block that will be plugged in when greet.html is used. So again, these files now differ only in terms of the contents of that block. So if I toggle back and forth here, you'll see that, and let me add spacing just for consistency here, index.html has the form, greet.html has the hello, and the placeholder for name. All right, after all of that work, let me go back to app.py, and surprise, don't need to change anything. Because I'm using the render template function, it knows not only how to handle those curly braces with variables as placeholders, it also understands curly brace percent signs, curly brace, as per the documentation for Jinja itself. So in fact, what I'm going to go ahead and do now is go back to my web page without changing anything in app.py. Just for good measure, I'll reload this page here. Wasn't expecting this to happen, but I've clearly induced a problem. I'm now getting one of these 500 internal server errors. So how do I diagnose this? Well, a good programmer would know to go back to their terminal window, go specifically to the one that's running Flask, and here we have another Jinja exception, template syntax error, expected token end of statement block got string. Now, where is that? Let's go back into my layout.html, and this looks correct. Let me go back into index.html. Super subtle. I did something dumb. Can anyone spot the mistake before I reveal? Anyone see it? Very subtle. And I think, yes, we have someone pointing it out. I stupidly forgot my double quote. So that's all. And that's why it was seeing a string or a stir instead of the tags as it expected. So subtle, and I was holding my breath that I was actually going to be able to solve that in front of everyone, but the solution was clearly, or the hint to the solution was clearly in my terminal window. So now, let's hide my terminal window, go back to my other tab, cross my fingers, which maybe I forgot to do before, which is the problem, reload. There we go. Index.html is working, and if I type in my name and hit enter or click greet, now the whole thing is working again. But more importantly, if I view page source, notice that I indeed see that the same template has been used, the same blueprint, if you will, for this page, as well as, if we go look at the other, all of this stuff is common to these files. Now, as an aside, once you're in the browser viewing the output from the server, it's OK if not everything is pretty printed perfectly. What matters when it comes to style with web programming, as with programming in general, is what you and other developers see on the server. The browser is perfectly OK with there being less or more white space just because it was all dynamically generated. But indeed, if I go back now, not just to hello, not just to my greet route, but this one, and view page source, you'll see that what's been generated by the server is indeed almost the same up until a point. All right. So up until now, we've only been using HTTP GET requests, whereby any user input, whether it's from the form or manually typed in, is indeed being sent from browser to server via the URL itself. But it turns out there are other methods that we can use besides GET. Recall that there's also POST. And POST treats your data a little more privately in the sense that it still kind of puts it into that virtual envelope, but it shoves it down deeper such that it doesn't appear in the user's URL bar. This, of course, is compelling if it's a password, credit card, or anything personal or private. So how can we switch our own application, for instance, from using GET to using POST instead? Well, let me propose that we go back first to index.html, because it's in index.html that we explicitly specified a method of GET before. So it's very easy in HTML to change the method that this form is going to use from GET to POST. Now, weirdly, again, in HTML, you should lowercase GET and POST, even though when you see them inside the actual virtual envelope or in your developer tools, it's capital, it's an uppercase GET and an uppercase POST. But that said, let's go ahead and see what happens when I make that simple change from GET to POST in my form alone. Because I've changed my HTML, I'm going to reload the page just to make sure I have the latest HTML in my browser's memory. I'm going to type my name as before, and I'm going to click greet. And notice this time that the URL is not going to display name equals David, because I've switched from GET to POST. Enter. But even though I'm ending up at /greet, and I'm not seeing !, name equals David, the method is not allowed. This is a weird 405 error. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out if I go into app.py, by default, when you create a route using Flask, as in line 6 or in line 11, by default, only GET is going to be supported. But if you read the documentation or follow along here, you can tell Flask what additional methods, if any, to actually support. So in fact, if I want this greet method to actually support not GET, but instead post, what I can do is pass in a second argument, a named parameter, and say methods equals, and then pass in a Python list of methods that I want to support. If I only want to support post, I can literally just do quote unquote post. If I want to support get and post, I can do both as a comma separated list inside of this Python list. Because again, from week 6, recall that square brackets imply that this is indeed a Python list. But for now, I'm fine with just supporting post. And so I just pass in as the value of methods a list with one value, quote unquote post, in all caps. All right, let's now go back to my browser tab. Let's go back to the form. Let me type in my name again, crossing my fingers, and greet. And now, oh, so close. The error is gone, but it's not greeting me. It's using that default value, hello, comma, world. Now, this makes sense at a glance because clearly there's no parameter being passed into the URL. But my code, it turns out, was assuming that if there were a parameter, it would come in via get, not via post. And this is among the weirder design decisions in Flask. But whereas get parameters are stored in request.args, as we saw, a dictionary that gives you all of those key value pairs from the URL, post requests, key value pairs, are stored in Flask using request.form. So it makes sense that they come from the form, but it's a little ambiguous, at least to me, like why we say args here and form here. You just kind of have to memorize it or look it up. Request.args is for get. Request.form is for post. The implication then is if I go back to VS Code here, it's a pretty simple change. I just have to change request.args to request.form. So I look in the right place for that key value pair. Let me go back to my other browser tab, click reload, noticing that the browser is now going to caution me, are you sure you want to resubmit this form? And that's useful because you don't want to accidentally pay for something twice on a website by submitting your credit card twice. You don't want to type in your password maybe more times than needed. Okay. And so in this, or send your password more times than needed. So the browser's cautioning me, because I'm using post underneath the hood, do I actually want to resubmit this form? So yes, in this case. So I'm going to click continue. And now I do see hello, comma, David, because it's been passed in underneath the hood, if you will, inside more deeply that envelope. And we can actually see this. Let's do one other thing here. Let me go back to the form. Let me right-click or control-click on my viewport and click Inspect to open up the developer tools. Let me go under Network here, and let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and type in my name, and then click Greet. And like last week, when we were poking around all of the HTTP requests going back and forth from browser to server, let's see what the browser's actually sending. When I click Greet, I indeed see that the URL at the top changed to /greet, but there's no mention of David or name. But if I go down here into my developer tools and click on that HTTP request in my log, I can now scroll down and see, the request method was apparently post. And if I scroll down further, I'll see not only the response, but if I keep going, I'll also see the request headers, which are sent inside of that envelope as well. But what I really care about in this case is payload. If I click on payload, this is a term of art that means what inputs are you sending from browser to server. You'll see a list here of all of the form data, name, David. So you can actually see in your browser's developer tools exactly what was sent. And you can do this on any website. The next time you log into a website, buy something online, you can poke around the network tab of your developer tools and see all of the key value pairs. And frankly, you're going to probably see many more values than you might have expected, because browsers, of course, have lots and lots of features, more than we're implementing in these simple examples, but it's just key value pairs again and again. All right, so we've solved a bunch of problems now. In fact, we've even added a layer of privacy, if you will, insofar as the data is still being sent, yes, but it's not showing up in the URL, which means it's not going to end up in my autocomplete, which means it's not going to end up in my history in the same way, which is indeed great for anything private like credit cards or the like. But what more can we do here? Well, as we've often done in the past, let me see if we can tighten up our code a little bit. For instance, could we use a single route and still implement the same application? Now, this might not be desirable, so consider this an example of how you could collapse some of your code into fewer lines. But this isn't necessarily to say it's the right way or the only way to do things, but I do think it's compelling in some cases. As you'll see, for instance, in the problem set for this coming week, wherein we adopt a similar paradigm to try to keep the code a little bit simpler. So let me go back into app.py, and let me propose to do this. Let's just have one route, / that does everything, including presenting the form and also displaying hello so-and-so. But let's support both get and post for this route.
Okay.
So I'm going to say methods equals, and then in a Python list, quote unquote get, comma, quote unquote post, overriding the default, which again is just get. Then inside of this function, what I'm going to do is this. If request.method equals post, then let's do this. Else, let's do this. In other words, if the request coming in happens to be post, and this is just another special variable inside of the request object, which we imported earlier, turns out there's another variable, if you will, called method, and you can check what is the method that came from the browser. Is it get? Is it post? Is it something else too? And if it is, let's go ahead and do this. Else, if it's not, it's presumably get, so let's just render the default template. So what can I now do? I can grab this code from greet and delete it. Let me delete the greet function entirely. And I think what I can do is just move all of this functionality in here. Let me fix my indentation. But now, if the request method is post, then I'm going to do exactly what we did before. Else, I'm going to display the form to the user. So what more do I need to change? Let me go back to my index.html, wherein previously I had an action value of /greet, but this is no longer applicable. There is no more greet route. I just want to submit to /. And frankly, at this point, I can also just get rid of action altogether because the browser, by default, will assume you want to submit to the same URL from whence you came. But to be explicit, I'll go ahead and leave it for now. Let me go back now to my browser tab and go back. Let me reload to get the very latest of everything. Let me go ahead and type in David and watch now that the URL does not, in fact, change to /greet, but I am, in fact, greeted. There's no /greet anymore.
I have an error here. I have an error here. Hold up. Let's see what we're wrong. Methods get post index. If request.method equals post, name equals request.form dot get name world, return render template greet HTML name equals name. Why is mine wrong? App.route. Let's take our guy here. Do I have any typos? There's no typo. Do I? Instead of if request.method equals post. Why am I not getting this to work appropriately? Oh, now it is. Okay, now it's working.
Value of /greet tab and go back. Let me reload to get the very latest of everything. Let me go ahead and type in David and watch now that the URL does not, in fact, change to /greet, but I am, in fact, greeted. There's no /greet anymore, but it was, in fact, sent from browser to server using post, and my web application now, using just a single route, is handling both methods now in this case. All right, so we've tightened things up, which might be useful for larger web applications.
So what is the difference really between this get and post? Like, he kind of never really went into that, like, in terms of what they actually did. And what these, he kind of is really, I don't know, I'm a little bit disappointed in this lecture so far. It's pretty vague. He's kind of moving over things, kind of anticipating that you kind of already know what's kind of going on with Flask, really, but he's not actually telling you like the why things are happening and like why it's necessary to have these certain things. So, I honestly, this so far hasn't been the greatest lecture in actually learning this. He's mainly just showing you what to do, but actually not giving you any application into why really you are doing these things. Mainly like just do this and it works. So I yeah, it's I don't know. I'm not too thrilled on this week's lecture so far. It's not giving me a lot of actual knowledge information about what I'm doing. It's mainly just kind of copying and pasting what he's doing on the screen, really. So gets data, post data. Like to do invent a time machine.
Wherein we might want to not have as many functions and complexity in our app.py, but what more can we now do? Well, it turns out Jinja, the templating library that Flask uses, has its own documentation page. And frankly, it's super long, but there's some fairly simple features documented therein. And I'll show us at least one of them here. So at Jinja, thus far, it allows us to place values inside of those curly braces. It also allows us to do that block feature, which is really templating by definition, to grab the contents of layout.html and plug in this particular template's block of code. But we can do other things conditionally even in Jinja as well. So for instance, suppose I want in app.py to just get rid of this logic whereby I am not only getting the form from the value from the form, I'm also passing in a default value in app.py. Suppose that I want to relegate these default values to the templates, because after all, if the templates are what the humans actually see, it's pretty reasonable then for whoever is creating the templates, put the default values closest to the user in those templates. So this is to say, let me just get rid of this default value of name, for name of quote unquote world. And just no matter what is in the form, go ahead and just pass it into the template. And frankly, as before, we don't strictly need this variable at all. I can get rid of this whole line 9 and just replace name equals and then the return value of request.form.get quote unquote name in order to get that value. Same thing, just getting rid of a variable if nothing else. But I have gotten rid of the default value, quote unquote world. How can I restore that? Well, here's what's cool about Jinja and templating techniques in general with web programming. If I go back to greet.html, I don't want to just blindly say hello, comma, name, because name might be blank. It might not have an actual value. But it turns out that's OK. What I'm going to do here is the following. Instead of just saying hello, I'm going to go ahead and say hello, comma, and then if there is a name value, then let's go ahead and spit it out inside of these double curly braces. Else, if there is no name value, then let's go ahead and spit out the word world. And then, as before, use end and the same name as the first tag, and if. So we haven't seen the syntax yet, but it's clearly similar in spirit to the block syntax. And this is Jinja's syntax for doing something conditionally. If name has a value that's not empty, like quote unquote, then go ahead and just display the name right here. Else, if it is a blank value or absent altogether, go ahead and spit out world instead, and that's it for the if conditional. Now notice I've used like several lines of code here, which seems weird because I don't want it to say hello, comma, and then the person's name on the next line. But remember how HTML works. It's going to ignore anything more than a single white space. So even though the name or the word world are on different lines, all of that white space is going to get collapsed into a single space visually for the user in the browser. So if I did this right, let's go back over to my tab here, and let's go ahead and hit reload on the page itself by clicking on the URL and hitting enter. I didn't want to hit Command R or Control R because I don't want to resubmit the form. I want to reload the page, and the best way to do that would be indeed to just go ahead and click on the URL and hit enter. Let me go ahead and type my name in and click greet, and hopefully there I am again. Hello, comma, David. If I view page source here, notice you see the template, and you even see that my name is on a new line because that's where it was in the conditional, but the browser doesn't care. It's consolidating all of that multiple white space into a single white space instead.
Okay.
So that's a lot of examples just to say hello world, but the overarching goal here thus far has been to implement really the simplest of web applications that takes user input, produces dynamically HTML that corresponds to that input, effectively implementing our very first back end. Of course, all of these examples thus far really just say hello world to the user. So let's go ahead, though, take a break, and when we come back and say, let's say 5 minutes, we will see how you could implement your very own website for a freshman intramural sports program, just as I did like 25 years ago by teaching myself web programming after having taken CS50. Unfortunately, the internet back in the late 90s looked quite like this. I don't know to this day why I used a repeating background image, but that's what the web looked like. But we'll see ultimately how you could implement something like this when we return in 5 minutes. See you soon.
All right, and we'll stop there for today on the lecture watch along.